Today I want to talk to you about two archetypes first proposed by Carl Gustav Jung, Anima and Animus, femininity and masculinity. But it is a lot more complex than this, a lot deeper and more profound, and it has implications on a variety of fields in the humanities and social sciences. I will delve deeper today into Jung's thinking about these issues and how they relate to narcissism and other mental health pathologies. But before we go there, I would like to remind you that I am no fan of Carl Gustav Jung. Synchronicity, collective unconscious, unidentified flying objects, UFOs? Seriously? The guy sounds 90% of the time as a deranged and demented New Age self-styled prophet rather than a serious psychiatrist. Taking into account that Carl Jung has been hospitalized for psychosis early on in his life and attributed most of his work to this period, no wonder. So I'm not a fan, and yet I find some of his insights, especially the archetypes, to be of great interest. And I am very sorry, I grieve the fact that modern academia, higher education institutions, have given up on the likes of Freud and Jung, because these were clever, insightful people who have had a lot to say about the human psyche. And apropos clever, insightful people, my name is Sam Vaknin. I'm the author of Malignant Self-Love, Narcissism Revisited. I'm also a professor of psychology. And no, I don't think UFOs exist, and synchronicity and the collective unconscious are rank nonsense. But today we're going to discuss Anima and Animus, an entirely different thing. Anima and Animus are Jungian terms. They describe the unconscious female image in men and the unconscious male image in women. Now, before we go any further, before we study this any more deeply, I would like to make a general comment. Both Sigmund Freud, the erstwhile mentor of Carl Gustav Jung, and Carl Jung himself, both of them have been mired and immersed and embedded in their own cultures and society. Freud operated in Vienna at the end of the 19th century and beginning of the 20th century, a period of repressed sexuality and Victorian mores. Jung worked mostly in Zurich, but Switzerland was not exempt. Sexuality was less of a taboo than in Vienna, but gender roles were very strict and firm, Germanic in a way. And so when Freud discusses femininity or masculinity, and when Jung discusses femininity and masculinity, they adhere very closely to socially assigned performative gender roles. Women are women, men are men. Jung, for example, says that the anima, the feminine element, has to do with relatedness, eros, and anima in women are more compassionate and more empathic and so on. Whereas rationality, logos, is attributed to the animus, to the masculine principle, and to men in general. So according to Jung, women are compassionate and do well on empathy and relatedness, whereas men are logical and rational. These are, of course, stereotypes, and the false equation of culturally acquired elements with inborn male and female characteristics is a major detriment, a major problem with Jung's work. Let us agree on some terminology. Let us disambiguate some words. Start with archetype. Jung established a branch of psychology known as analytic psychology. And in analytic psychology, archetype is any one of a set of symbols which represent aspects of the psyche that derive from the accumulated experience of mankind. Archetypes are inherited symbols, and they are held in what Jung called the collective unconscious. The archetypes serve as frames of reference with which individuals view the world, and as the foundations on which the structure of personality is built. You would be surprised what constitutes an archetype. I mentioned the anima and animus, they're both archetypes, but also the persona. The persona is the mask that we wear when we interact with other people. Shadow, the shadow is an archetype. And even the self, the supreme being, the hero, they're all archetypes, archetypal images, primordial images. Okay, so now that we've understood what archetypes are, they are figments of the collected, cumulative wisdom of humanity over the ages. Let's revert to anima. The problem with anima is that there are two definitions in Jung's writings. In the earlier period, anima was designated by Jung as a person's innermost being, a person's soul, if you wish, the part that is in closest contact with the unconscious. And so anima in the early writings of Jung, the early work of Jung, has nothing to do with femininity. It is the antithesis, it is the opposite of the persona. The persona is the externally directed part of the personality, whereas the anima is the internalized part, the part that is in touch with the unconscious. Only much later, in his later writings, did Jung equate the anima with an archetype. The anima became the archetype that represents universal feminine characteristics, or the unconscious feminine aspect of the male psyche. Animus, on the other hand, was always, in the totality of Jung's work, has always been an archetype. In analytical psychology, animus is the archetype that represents universal masculine characteristics or the unconscious masculine component of the female psyche. Anima and animus are therefore internalized figures, internalized representations. So the anima is the internalized representation of a woman, the quintessential woman, held by men, and the animus is the figure of a man at work in a woman's psyche. Now, because Jung held such rigid views of gender roles, because he stereotyped women and men, he regarded gender roles as a task, as a burden, as something that requires an investment, consumes energy, and generally depletes you. A gender role is performative, so it requires a performance. And so according to Jung, all of us suffer from what we call nowadays gender dysphoria. We are assigned a gender by society. We are trained like so many monkeys, we are trained to become men and women. Boys become men, girls become women. And then for the rest of our lives, we perform. We perform manhood. We perform masculinity, or we perform femininity, but it's a performance. And like every performance, it requires time and effort and energy and forethought and analysis and cognitions and emotions. It consumes you. So it's a burden. And because it's a burden, the psyche, the soul, requires some kind of compensation. Anima and animus are gender-specific archetypal structures in the collective unconscious that are therefore compensatory to burdensome, difficult to maintain conscious gender identities. Your anima, if you're a man, your anima is a feminine compensation for the fact that you have to consistently and constantly act as a man. And if you're a woman, your animus is a masculine element in you, which compensates for the fact that you're not allowed to express your inner masculinity and that you're supposed to conform to a highly rigid and specific performative gender role. These are compensatory mechanisms. Does it remind you of something? Narcissism, pathological narcissism, is a compensatory mechanism. It compensates mainly for shame and other negative effects and negative experiences in childhood, abuse, trauma, parentification, instrumentalization, and so on. So these specific archetypes are compensatory. And as we will see a bit later during this long lecture, there is a connection between the compensatory nature of anima and animus and the compensatory nature of narcissism. Animus images primarily depict the unconscious masculine in a woman, and anima images depict the unconscious feminine in a man. Of course, there is this assumption that there are parts of us which are suppressed and repressed by social expectations, mores, conventions, and norms. Every man has a feminine part, but this feminine part is buried, is denied, is refrained, is repressed, because men are not allowed to express their femininity. It is a no-no, sometimes even a taboo. The notion of a buried part, femininity in men and masculinity in women, this notion first appeared, in print at least, in Carl Gustav Jung's Psychological Types. It's a book he published in 1921. One of the most complex and least understood features of Jung's theory is the idea of contra-sexual archetypes. Jung wanted to conceptualize the important complementary roles in human psychological functioning. Jung saw everything in terms of duality or polarity. In other words, his approach to human psychology was adversarial, conflict-driven. Even if the conflict was subdued, even if the conflict was only a background potential, it was still there. The duality and the polarity implied that some parts had to submit and other parts of human psyche had to dominate. Jung conceived of the anima initially as numinous, in other words, a spiritual figure in a man's unconscious. Strangely, he did not say the same about the animus. Jung tended to idealize femininity and women in general. Originally, Jung associated the anima with a mother figure and the animus with a father figure. But then he transitioned from that and he began to identify the roots of the anima and animus on a broader spectrum. By 1925, Jung considered these concepts the two most comprehensive foundations of the psyche. He said that anima and animus are the two pillars upon which the totality of human psychology is based. Anima and animus, Jung says, are inborn as what he called virtual images. And these virtual images acquire form in, I'm quoting, the encounter with empirical facts which touch the unconscious aptitude and quicken it to life. Jung, 1928. However, it is here that we are beginning to see the failures and mistakes in Jung's attitude. What he considered to be empirical facts were actually time-relevant, culture-bound stereotypes, perceptions of femininity and masculinity founded on a highly specific, doxastic, and axiological framework, a framework of beliefs and values. The Victorian period regarded women and men as totally separate, assigned to them very rigid gender roles. And so Jung took these to be universal. He believed that everything he knew about femininity and masculinity as gender roles in the 19th century is universal and has applied throughout the existence of mankind, which is, of course, profoundly counterfactual, nonsensical even. The initial contra-sexual content, according to Jung, is introjected from the infant's relationship with parental figures. In other words, the infant triggers the anima. If the infant is a boy, the boy triggers the anima in him by relating to the mother. Whereas if it's a girl, she triggers the animus via her interactions with her father. The mother and the father are the triggers that bring to life the energy and the capacity of the animus and the anima, however unconscious they may be. Unconsciously, they're active. Mother and the father activate them. Developmentally then, separation from parental figures as primary objects, followed by the idealizing and the identification of anima and animus with figures in the environment, persons of opposite sex, is what we call growing up. Growing up is when we transition our anima or animus to other people who are not parental figures, not mother, not father, but they become the receptacles and the repositories of our anima and animus. In other words, anima and animus are the bridges that connect us to people of the opposite sex. We tend to project our anima and animus, which are essentially reflections of our parental figures. We tend to project them on people of the opposite sex when we form intimate romantic relationships. And this, of course, ties very well with the narcissist's inexorable, urgent need to bond with a maternal figure in his intimate relationships. The narcissist converts his partners into maternal figures, partly by foisting on them, imposing on them the anima in the narcissist, if he's a male, or the animus, if it's a female. So what the narcissist does, the narcissist imposes the anima in him on his potential intimate partner. The anima has the face and the attributes and the contours of his original mother. We'll discuss this some other time. Let's continue with anima and animus. Because it's a projection, because when you interact with a person of the opposite sex, you're projecting onto her your anima or animus. Because it's a projection, it can be withdrawn. A projection can be withdrawn from the objects upon which it had been projected. And the apperception of anima and animus as intrapsychic objects then becomes conscious. In other words, when you bond with an intimate partner, let's assume that you're male. When you bond with an intimate partner, you project onto her your anima. When the relationship goes sour, when you break up with your intimate partner, when you divorce, when you dump each other, when there's a devalue, even when there's a devalue and discard within the shared fantasy, at that point, something interesting happens. At that point, you withdraw the anima. And as you withdraw the anima, it becomes conscious. The deficiency, the need, the lack of an intimate partner reminds you of your feminine side. You are leveraging your feminine side to find an intimate partner unconsciously. But when she's gone, your feminine side is sorely missed and it becomes conscious. Of course, the opposite applies in the case of a woman. The woman applies the animus, the masculine side, to her partner. When the partner is gone, when she breaks up with the partner, the animus becomes visible, perceptible, and she misses the masculine presence, and the animus becomes conscious. Anima and animus can act as the ego's interface to the collective unconscious, according to Jung. In most clinical instances, Anima and Animus personify the struggle between culture-bound collective images of masculine and feminine and the developmental urge to liberate one's individuality from these collective norms. In other words, the figures of Anima and Animus embedded in each one of us, depending on our sex, these figures are both the interface to society because they conform to a large extent to cultural mores, societal norms and expectations, gender roles, on the one hand, and on the other hand, the Anima and Animus are the great liberators. They allow us to experience the opposite sex vicariously and in defiance of collective edicts, injunctions, and norms. It's again a kind of gender dysphoria. Carried to the extreme, it leads to transgender experiences. The concepts of Anima and Animus include the potential in women and men to develop both masculine and feminine elements in themselves. The contra-sexual archetypes fuel what used to be known as the Oedipal predicament, part of the Oedipus complex, because the differentiation between the parental imagos and the Anima and Animus projections leads out of the Oedipal fixation. I'll discuss it some other time. What about narcissism? I mentioned that there is a kind of interface with narcissism, nexus with narcissism. A narcissistic identification with a contra-sexual figure may result in positive or negative inflation. In other words, you could acquire, as the narcissist can acquire grandiosity. The narcissist can inflate himself, distort his cognitions, and embed himself in a counterfactual fantasy regarding his own self-concept by leveraging his anima or her animus. The contra-sexual figures are helpful with grandiosity because they are projected onto a partner in the process of idealization, which is always a part of co-idealization. In other words, a male narcissist would project the anima onto an intimate partner who is a female, idealize her, and by idealizing her, idealize himself. If she's perfect, that makes him perfect. Alternatively, if the narcissistic identification with the contra-sexual figure is ego-dystonic, in other words, it raises gender dysphoria, for example, in bisexual narcissists or homosexual narcissists, this could lead to what is known as flooding of the ego, a deterioration, the intrusion of unconscious contents into consciousness, into the ego, and the disabling of the ego's ability to interface with reality to maintain reality testing. So, both anima and animus are psychic images. Each one of them is a configuration based largely on stereotypes and gender roles and culture-bound and period-relevant images and so on. It's all true. But this configuration arises from a basic archetypal structure according to Jung. And this archetypal structure, these archetypes are not dependent on any specific culture, any specific period in history, any specific society, any specific expectations or norms or conventions. So these archetypes are immutable. As the fundamental forms which underlie the feminine aspect of men and the masculine aspects of women, they are opposites. As psychic components, they are subliminal to consciousness. They are pre-conscious or unconscious. And they function from within the unconscious part of the psyche. They are of benefit, but they can also endanger consciousness. There is a process which Jung described, and he called it possession. Yes, I told you I don't like Jung. He called it possession. Possession is when there is an identification of consciousness with an unconscious content or unconscious complex or unconscious archetype. In other words, sometimes there's a situation where the anima and animus archetypes are so overwhelming for whatever reason. For example, unresolved business with a maternal or paternal figure. These archetypes are active, energetically active, they're overwhelming. They create, in therapy, abreaction, for example. So they're overwhelming, they can take over. They can take over the consciousness, which could lead to conscious gender dysphoria or to conscious conflict between masculine and feminine aspects. And so the anima and animus operate in relation to the dominant psychic principle of a man or a woman. In other words, in every man and woman, we have an explicit, overt, visible text, which is a narrative on how to be a man, how to be a woman, gender roles, scripts, and we follow them. This is the dominant psychic principle of manhood and womanhood. And at the same time, subversively, like some kind of insurgents or terrorists, the anima and animus undermine these dominant and explicit psychic principles. They kind of challenge them in many ways. Again, you can see the adversarial, conflictual view of Jung with regards to some processes in the psyche. As the contra-sexual psychological counterparts of maleness and femaleness, anima and animus are there to always destabilize the gender role, always question it, always propose alternatives by projecting themselves. So we could say that the anima and animus act as what Jung called the psychopompi. Psychopomp is a guide, the guide of the soul, a mediator between the unconscious and the conscious realms. So anima and animus are a bridge between the conscious and the unconscious. They're psychopompi. They're not only a bridge, but they are guiding. They provide guidance. They structure. They introduce order. And this is symbolically personified in dreams as a wise man or a wise woman. And so the parental role of the anima and animus, or the parental reflections, the imago, parental personification, the parental embodiment of mother and father, also carries with it the element of guidance, the element of sagacity, the element of wisdom, and the safe or secure bridge between conscious and unconscious. The anima and animus are necessary links with creative possibilities and instruments of individuation. Remember that in the process of individuation, there's a lot of exploration, a lot of experimentation. Individuation is about resolving the initial doubts. It's about asking yourself, who am I? Including, am I a man or a woman? Am I a boy or a girl? Individuation is what Erickson called a process of moratorium. It's a process of indecisiveness, exploring all the possibilities. And the anima and animus are there to guide you because they are contra-sexual. The fact that a boy has an anima informs the boy that he is a male. And similarly, the animus in the woman, in the girl, informs her that she should become a woman because they are contra-sexual. As personified components of the psyche, the anima and animus connect and involve us with life. They are what Jung called personification, the tendency of psychic contents or complexes to take on a distinct personality separate from the ego. Freud implied, therefore, that we all harbor a multiplicity of personalities, which today we call self-states. Philip Bromberg's work stretching all the way to my own work, we assume that the personality is a piece of fiction, does not exist. What we do have is a series of self-states. And Jung is not far from this in his principle of personification. A complete realization and integration of either image, the anima or the animus. It requires a partnership with the opposite sex. It is through a relationship with the opposite sex, through this interpersonal exchange, that we reconcile with the anima or animus. It is then that we integrate the anima and animus. There's no longer a splitting defense against the anima and animus. I'm a boy, don't remind me that I have a feminine aspect. It is through a relationship with a girl. A man has a relationship with a woman, and he learns to accept his femininity through her, because in many ways he becomes one with her. Not in all ways, that's unhealthy, but in some ways he becomes one with his intimate partner. And this oneness, this unitary, non-symbiotic nature of the healthy relationship legitimizes the anima in the man or the animus in the woman. Among his definitions of anima, remember that anima went through a major transformation in Jung's writings. But Jung summarized anima animus as soul images. When he was asked to elucidate this statement, he called each one of them the not I. So the not I for a man probably corresponds to something feminine, and the not I in a woman would be something masculine, something outside herself, something that belongs not to her, but to some kind of soul or spirit, which is ostensibly, according to Jung, the collective spirituality of humankind transmitted from one generation to the next and actually embedded in the brain. The anima or animus, as the case may be, it's a factor which happens to the individual. It's an a priori element of moods, reactions, impulses in a man, of commitments, beliefs, and inspirations in a woman. In both of them, there's something that prompts you to take cognizance of whatever is spontaneous and meaningful in your psychic life. Their anima and animus are therefore founds, sources of self-awareness and creativity, because they're constantly there, nagging at you, if you will. And they give rise to attributes and traits and behaviors even, which are alien to your gender role. And you're a man, you're a man's man, and suddenly you're tender and soft and kind and compassionate and empathic. And that doesn't sit well with the classic gender role of a macho man. You cry or you do something. That is your anima. Similarly, you're a woman, and suddenly you are tough, competitive, ambitious, and disympathetic and rational and logical and so on. And that doesn't sit well with the stereotype or the gender role of a woman, and that is your masculine side. Behind the animus, Jung said, lies the archetype of meaning, just as the anima is the archetype of life itself. So there's a layer which is the anima, and anima is identified with what Freud would have called libido, the force of life, the élan vital, and superimposed on it is the interpretation of life, the exploration of life, and making sense and meaning of life. And that is the mens preserve. That is a masculine trait. Of course, you can see the prejudices of Jung in action. Possession by either anima or animus. Remember, possession is when unconscious content takes over consciousness. Possession by either anima or animus. It transforms the personality, of course, because it gives prominence to traits which are seen psychologically as traits of the opposite sex. Either way, a person loses individuality, and then in either case, both charm and values. So if there is a possession, if the anima side in a man takes over, he becomes dominated by it and by the eros principle. So he becomes restless, promiscuous, moody, sentimental, exactly like the stereotypical woman of the 19th century with her inevitable hysteria. Whereas, and so this is unconstrained, overwhelming, dysregulating emotionality. That's how Jung saw it, of course, which is all wrong. Similarly, Jung believed that if a woman is subjected to the dominance, control, or invasion, a hostile takeover of the animus and logos, she becomes bossy, managerial, obstinate, ruthless, and domineering. Either way, they become one-sided. They become one-dimensional. He implied that when the animus and anima take over, it's a reductionist process. It's not a healthy thing. These people who are possessed by the animus or anima, animus in a woman, anima in a man, these people are inferior because they're gullible. They become seduced. Other people, other forms, meaningless attachments can take over them. Second-rate thinking, marching forward under crazy, unrelated conviction. In short, when you're taken over by these archetypes, when you're a man and taken over by the feminine anima, or a woman taken over by the masculine anima, you are reduced to a caricature of the opposite sex, and your functionality deteriorates dramatically. James Hillman wrote a book titled Anima and Anatomy of a Personified Notion, 1972, I think, and then there was an edition in 1975, if I'm not mistaken. And he wrote that it is she who personifies the unconsciousness of our entire Western culture, and maybe the image by which we will be liberated imaginatively. Positive or natural animus in contrast to the negative and acquired animus, suggested Ulanov in 1981. In other words, both Hillman and Ulanov introduced or expanded the remit of anima and animus to the collective social sphere. Whereas Ulanov said that there are two types of animus, positive and natural, as distinct from negative and acquired, implying that women have a negative acquired animus, whereas men have a positive and natural animus. It's an indirect criticism of feminism, of course, while Hillman said that anima should be the organizing principle, because through anima, we're going to be liberated and become creative and imaginative. The anima can be considered as a general form, an archetype, or also as a particular embodiment of the archetype in a specific individual, a kind of personal complex. So back to archetypes. The archetype is a psychological motivational pattern. It is inherent in the human nature of all people. As Jung put it, it's a typical basic form of certain ever-recurring psychic experiences. It has a universal aspect. It's universal, and it has features which are also universal. And Jung referred to or related to mythology, where mythology, he said, distills cultural expressions of archetypal motives. But for any archetype, each individual has his or her particular version. It is not true that my archetypes are the same as your archetypes. Every individual modifies the archetype somehow, amends it, adapts it to conform to the personality of the individual. So it's a complex that varies from one person to the next, depending on life experiences, constitutional, psychological factors, and so on. And this complex, anima and animus are archetypes. By definition, they are kind of complexes. This complex is stable because it's attitudinal, emotional, motivational. It forms a pattern within the overall personality and across the lifespan. So let's translate this into daily life. In any relationship with a woman, a man will tend to project elements of the anima complex. and he will project it as a kind of image. In a way, he will retouch the woman, like as if Photoshop the woman. It's very, very close to idealization. It's hair thin boundary between them. The difference between this and idealization is that when the narcissist projects elements of his anima complex, he idealizes the woman, he converts her into a perfect being, a godlike entity with perfect elements and so on. Whereas when a healthy person projects the anima complex, it is not split. It is not all good or all bad. It's not idealized or devalued. It's very realistic. The anima picture, the anima complex in a healthy person includes both negative and positive aspects of femininity. It's a gray zone, not black and white. And then this anima complex is projected onto the woman. And from that moment on, the man perceives the woman through a filter. It's like a lens that reveals only those aspects of the real woman that conform to the unconscious prototype of his anima. In other words, the anima distorts the true picture, the true information about the intimate, the female intimate partner. It renders her a clone, a close replica of the anima complex within the man. Of course, the opposite applies to a woman. When a woman bonds or falls in love with a man or wishes to form an intimate or romantic relationship with a man, she projects onto the man her animus complex. And from that moment on, she sees the man as an extension of or outside reflection of her animus complex. So when we fall in love with other people, we actually fall in love with archetypes within our unconscious, and these archetypes have been formed by our parents. The mother forms the anima, the father forms the animus. There's a subtle skewing of attitudes and responses to the intimate partner based not on how he or she actually are, or even not on how he or she present themselves, but on the anima image that is projected onto them, or the animus image that is projected onto them. These images, these submerged archetypes, partly conscious, partly unconscious, affect the interpretation of how we perceive the presentation of the other. When we come across a potential intimate partner, she presents herself, but then immediately she's distorted by the men's anima. Similarly, the woman distorts potentially male partner by using the animus image. So you see the close proximity between this and the mechanisms of snapshotting and introjection in the narcissistic shared fantasy. What the narcissist does, he projects onto the intimate partner a diseased, imperfect and incomplete anima. The narcissist's mother is a dead mother. She has been emotionally absent, neglectful, domineering, overprotective, parentifying, instrumentalizing, abusive, traumatizing, and so on. A bad mother, not good enough mother. This mother creates in the child a deformed, defective, deficient, dysfunctional, sick anima. When the child grows up and becomes a narcissist, this adult projects this diseased anima onto a potential intimate partner and expects her to conform to this sickness, to this projected sickness. You could put it in simple terms. The narcissist as a child had a bad mother and a bad role model for what it is to be female. The first female the child comes across is the mother. If the mother is the wrong sort of mother, if the mother is a bad mother, then the child will develop an image of femininity which is wrong, which is sick, which is bad, which is dysfunctional. the anima would be inoperative, would be all wrong. And when this child grows up and teams up, so let's assume it's a man, teams up with a woman and wants to form an intimate romantic relationship, this kind of man would project onto her the wrong anima, the defective anima that had been created in his early childhood. And this anima will distort the perception of the intimate partner. And this is exactly the mechanism that is in operation in the shared fantasy. So relating to a real woman requires the man to try to relate to the disowned part of himself, which is his female side, his femininity. And this generates very positive dynamics because it drives the man towards a higher level of integration within his conflicted self-experience. Every man has an anima part. The anima part is the woman. It's feminine. The man disavows this part, rejects this part, denies this part. But when the man comes across a woman and falls in love with her, he projects onto her this rejected part. And because he loves her, he learns to love this part as well. He learns to love his anima as well. And by loving it, he integrates it with the rest of his personality. And he becomes an all-rounded figure, partly masculine, partly feminine. The gender role is the same. He's a man, and he acts as a man, and thinks as a man, and everything. But he allows himself to experience his feminine side. He wants to cry, he cries. He wants to act maternally with his newborn baby, he does. He's not ashamed, he's not afraid. He doesn't reject this side of him. Frattaroli, in 2002, wrote a book titled Healing the Soul in the Age of the Brain, Becoming Conscious in an Unconscious World. It was published by Viking in New York. And he wrote, when the projection of the anima and subsequent battle with the anima bearer happen in a patient's relationship with his psychoanalyst, as sooner or later they always do, this constitutes the transference. I'm going to read it again because it's a profound insight. When the projection of the anima and the subsequent battle with the bearer of the anima happen in the patient's relationship with his psychoanalyst, this is what we call transference. Transference, says Frattaroli, is usually understood as the tendency to react to another person as if he or she were an emotionally important figure from childhood. The idea being that feelings about a person from the past, memory of which is being resisted, are transferred onto a person in the present. In addition, and more significantly, transference is the tendency to react to another person as if he or she were an emotionally important but unconscious part of oneself. Here we recognize in the other person something that we cannot tolerate recognizing in ourselves, so that our feelings about something internal are transferred onto someone or something external. The philosopher Kierkegaard identified this latter dimension of transference, without calling it that, as an inverted image of the internal, in which what is threatening to emerge into awareness from inside is experienced as something pressing in from the outside. Well said. As you see, Anima and Animus are critical functions. They're archetypes, they're buried in the unconscious, but they're critical functions in all interpersonal relationships. And they're the bridge between some very important parts of the unconscious and consciousness. In this sense, I think Jung put his finger on some important issues. I completely differ with his structural model, with his dynamics, with his thinking. I'm not a Jungian. But I think this is a profound insight and is easily applicable and allows us to gain insight into the narcissistic condition. I think it provides us with added penetration and aha moments when it comes to the narcissist. Some unconscious structures in narcissism are distorted beyond redemption. And these are the ones that connect the narcissist to other people. So inevitably, these submerged, unconscious, sick archetypal structures infect the totality of the interpersonal interaction and render it as distorted and thwarted as the narcissist's inner world.